Welcome to Deep Dive. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's dive in and grow together.
Welcome to Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into Sai Deepak's book. It's called India, Bharat, and Pakistan, The Constitutional Journey of a Sandwiched Civilization. We're zeroing in on the years 1910 to 1924. Year is 1910. The 1905 partition of Bengal just happened, right? And it really shook things up. Different groups within Indian society are wrestling with their identities, what they want for the future. And one of the key themes that emerges, I think, is this debate around Hindu-Muslim unity and what that even meant. Like some figures, like Bipin Chandra Pal, for example, advocated for this passive resistance against British rule. And they really believed in the possibility of these two communities, Hindus and Muslims, coexisting harmoniously. But not everyone shared that optimism. Lala Lajpat Rai, for instance, he had a different take. He was much more skeptical. Now, things get really interesting with the 1909 Indian Councils Act. This act introduced separate electorates for Muslims. And that really threw a wrench into the whole unity debate, you could say, because, separate electorates meant that Muslims would vote only for Muslim candidates. And Rai saw this as kind of a step towards, solidifying those communal divisions, instead of bridging them. He even went so far as to call Hindu-Muslim unity a mirage. He argued that the Congress, in his view, was sacrificing Hindu interest to appease Muslims. He even pointed to how uncomfortable the Muslim League was with the celebration of Hindu figures like Shivaji, while they often glorified Mughal rulers. It was like, to him, a clear sign that the two communities had, fundamentally different visions for the future of India. Fast forward to 1911, and boom, the partition of Bengal is reversed. Seems like a win for unity, right? Not so simple. This whole annulment was a messy web of political maneuvering. You had Viceroy Hardinge trying to keep both the Congress and the Muslim League happy. Then there's King George V, who, believe it or not, actually disliked the partition. He wanted this big unifying gesture for the upcoming Delhi Durbar. Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1916. These wars sent shockwaves through the Indian Muslim community. They saw the Ottoman Empire, the heart of the Caliphate, weakening right before their eyes. This wasn't just some far-off political event. It hit deep, tied to their faith and identity. Figures like Syed Amir Ali and M.A. Ansari started rallying support for the Ottoman Caliphate. They stressed how important it was to Muslims everywhere. You can see how this anxiety and the feeling that the British just didn't care about their worries created a perfect breeding ground for pan-Islamism. This growing disillusionment with the British also made some Muslims question their loyalty to the Muslim League. And guess who's a perfect example of this? Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, he was a big advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity early on, but he ended up joining both the Congress and the Muslim League, trying to navigate this increasingly complicated political scene. Back in 1910, he gave a powerful speech urging Muslims to actively get involved in the Congress. He directly challenged the idea that it was a Hindu-dominated organization. He argued that Muslims needed to be shaping India's political future. It's fascinating to see this young Jinnah, years before he'd become the face of a separate Muslim nation. It really shows how fluid political identities and alliances were back then. Now fast forward to 1914. World War I breaks out and things get even more tangled. The Congress, hoping for more self-rule, initially backed the war effort. But at the same time, the Home Rule movement was picking up speed. Figures like Annie Besant and Bal Gangadhar Tilak were leading the charge. In the middle of all this, the Congress and the League, they managed to strike this temporary alliance. With the Lucknow Pact of 1916, this pact, it aimed for self-governance within the British Empire. And to make this alliance happen, the Congress agreed to some big concessions: separate electorates for Muslims, SH, and communal vetoes on certain issues. So separate electorates, that meant Muslims would vote for their own representatives in, separate constituencies, ensuring a certain level of Muslim representation in the government. And communal vetoes, that allowed Muslim representatives to block any legislation that they thought was harmful to their community's interests. Now, on the surface, this Lucknow Pact, it looked like a step toward unity. But Deepak, he argues it was more of a strategic move for both parties. The Congress, they saw it as a way to get more support and present a united front against the British. The League, they saw it as a way to secure their own interests and get recognition for their demands. But those underlying tensions, those different visions for India's future, they were still there, simmering beneath the surface. Another interesting thing Deepak points out is this irony. The Congress condemned the idea of communal representation in Burma. They argued that it would divide the nation. Yet here they were, supporting it in India. Makes you wonder about their political strategies, right? Were they really committed to secularism? Or was it just like a convenient tool to advance their bigger objectives? Now, into this already complex and turbulent scene enters Gandhi, a figure who would completely change the course of Indian history. His arrival added this whole new dimension to the political landscape. Initially, you know what? Gandhi actually opposed the Home Rule movement, the movement that was advocating for more autonomy within the British Empire. He urged Indians to support Britain in the war, believing that showing loyalty would help them make a stronger case for self-governance later on. But Gandhi's stance, it was about to change. He saw the Khilafat movement, this growing movement, as an opportunity, a chance to unite Hindus and Muslims under a common cause, and create this powerful force for Swaraj. The idea of complete independence from British rule. It was a risky gamble, and as we'll see, it had far-reaching consequences, both the ones they intended and the ones they didn't. And then in 1919, the British government throws another wrench into things by passing the Rowlatt Act. This act gave them sweeping powers to crack down on dissent, and of course it faced huge opposition. Gandhi's Satyagraha movement gained even more momentum, partly fueled by the Khilafat movement. And then tragedy strikes. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre. General Dyer orders troops to fire on unarmed civilians. It was a brutal display of colonial power that left a deep scar on the nation's psyche. It shattered any remaining illusions about the British government's supposedly good intentions. The massacre, along with the Rowlatt Act, galvanized support for the non-cooperation movement led by Gandhi. This movement called for a boycott of British institutions and goods. It was a massive mobilization effort, and the Khilafat movement added even more energy to it. However, there were differences in participation between the Congress and the Muslim League. While the Congress largely embraced the movement, the League was more hesitant, focusing more on the Khilafat issue and seeing the non-cooperation movement as a means to that end. Now, let's talk about the Khilafat movement. This movement started as a pan-Islamic movement. Its goal was to protect the Ottoman Caliphate, which was facing a serious threat after World War I, and figures like the Ali brothers emerged as prominent leaders, rallying Muslims across India. This movement was a powerful expression of religious solidarity. It really tapped into this deep anxiety within the Muslim community about the fate of their spiritual leader. It also showed the growing influence of religious figures like the ulema, these Islamic scholars who were becoming more involved in politics. The role of the ulema, the Muslim religious scholars, during this time. They weren't just sitting on the sidelines, they were right in the thick of it, shaping the Khilafat movement, issuing fatwas, those religious decrees, to support it. One figure Deepak highlights is Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who later became India's first education minister. Azad, a big Khilafat supporter, he used Islamic scripture to justify the alliance with Hindus against the British. It's interesting, isn't it, how religious interpretations can change, especially in charged political situations. And this is where we see Gandhi entering the scene. He saw the Khilafat movement as this chance to bring Hindus and Muslims together, to share a struggle against the British. He believed that a united front was absolutely essential for achieving independence. Gandhi's involvement was a pivotal moment. You had his immense popularity, and then you had his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. This gave the Khilafat movement a whole new dimension. It also brought him closer to Muslim leaders like the Ali brothers. They saw him as a valuable ally. But this alliance, as well-intentioned as it was, it had its share of complexities. The Khilafat movement's focus on pan-Islamism sometimes clashed with the more India-centric goals of the Congress, and Gandhi's unwavering belief in nonviolence, well, that would be put to the test as the movement unfolded. Now, the Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, was a turning point. It officially dismantled the Ottoman Empire. It stripped the Sultan of his temporal powers and basically shrank Turkey down to a fraction of its former size. The Khilafat movement itself, it started to lose steam as this Mustafa Kemal Ataturk rose to power in Turkey. See, Kemal, he was a Turkish nationalist, all about modernizing and secularizing Turkey. And well, in 1924, he abolished the Caliphate. It was a huge blow to the Khilafat movement in India. Ironic, isn't it? The very thing they were fighting to protect gets dismantled by a Turkish leader. The demise of the Khilafat movement is a real setback for Gandhi's vision of a united India. It exposed those complexities of trying to align the Indian nationalist movement with this pan-Islamic cause. It showed that ultimately it had its own dynamics, its own agendas. This was a devastating blow to the Khilafat movement. It just shattered any remaining hopes about British goodwill. And it fueled resentment against them for what was seen as their role in this humiliation of Islam. But there were also divisions brewing within the movement itself. The Jamiat Ulema-e Hind, or JUH, this prominent body of Islamic scholars, they started taking a more assertive stance. They emphasized Islamic principles guiding political action, and that often put them at odds with the more secular approach of the Congress and even Gandhi himself. In all this simmering tension, it finally erupted in a horrific event, the Moplah riots of 1921. Fueled by religious fervor and anti-British sentiment, Moplah Muslims in the Malabar region of Kerala, they unleashed this wave of violence against Hindus. It was a dark chapter, marked by forced conversions, killings, and widespread destruction. The Moplah riots tragically exposed those deep communal fault lines running through Indian society. It's a dark stain on the history of the region. There are accounts from the time, like Annie Besant's letter. She called it Malabar's agony. It paints a horrifying picture of what happened. Killings, forced conversions, temples desecrated, Hindus fleeing for their lives. Just awful. It's estimated that tens of thousands of Hindus were displaced, and reports suggest over 10,000 Hindus died in the violence. The brutality of it all, it shocked a lot of people. Even those who initially had some sympathy for the Moplah's cause. B.R. Ambedkar, the one who drafted the Indian Constitution, he compared it to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Europe. That's how bad it was. Documents that long history of Moplah violence against Hindus, going all the way back to the 19th century. He cites British records, official reports, even legislation like the Moplah Outrages Act, which was specifically put in place to contain that recurring violence. By weaving all these threads together, Deepak presents a more nuanced view of the Moplah riots. He acknowledges the socioeconomic grievances, sure, but he also emphasizes that undeniable role of religious extremism, that deliberate targeting of Hindus based on their faith. He cites these chilling accounts of forced conversions, the destruction of temples, the brutal treatment of Hindu women. He uses eyewitness accounts, official reports, to paint this harrowing picture of the violence and its impact on the Hindu community. And he challenges the narrative that tries to paint the Moplah riots as a rebellion against British rule. He highlights the fact that the primary victims, they were Hindus, not British officials. While anti-British sentiment might have been a factor, he argues that the riots, they were primarily driven by a deep-seated religious animosity towards Hindus. And what's really striking is how he uses the words of the Moplahs themselves to expose their motivations. He quotes captured Moplah fighters who openly said they wanted to kill Hindus and establish an Islamic state. He even quotes a pamphlet from 1921 that explicitly called for the extermination of Hindus and the creation of an Islamic caliphate in Malabar. These first-hand accounts, combined with the systematic targeting of Hindu institutions and individuals, they make it impossible to ignore that religious dimension of the violence. Deepak's research, it really dismantles any attempts to downplay or whitewash the role of religious fanaticism in the Moplah riots. He also addresses the role of the Khilafat movement in all of this. He argues that the movement's rhetoric, which often invoked religious duty and the need for jihad against enemies of Islam, it created this climate of hostility and intolerance, and that this emboldened the Moplahs. He points to speeches by Khilafat leaders like the Ali brothers, who openly called for violence against those who opposed their demands. He also highlights the role of the JUH, which issued fatwas declaring it haram for Muslims to serve in the British Indian Army. This just fueled anti-British sentiment even more. To another crucial point, how did the British react to the Moplah riots? What did the colonial administration do in the face of this unprecedented violence against Hindus? The British response to the Moplah riots is actually a really complex and controversial part of this whole story. Deepak carefully examines official records, government reports, what British officials actually did, and it reveals a narrative that challenges how we usually think about it. His argument is that the British, while they condemned the violence officially, they were hesitant to actually do anything about it. They were afraid that being too harsh might alienate the Muslim community and risk losing their support for the war. He gives examples of British officials downplaying how bad the atrocities were. They often blamed it on things like agrarian unrest or economic grievances, instead of acknowledging the religious fanaticism behind it. He also points out how British courts were reluctant to punish the Moplah rioters severely. They often gave them lenient sentences or even acquitted them, despite clear evidence of their crimes. Deepak argues that this perceived leniency, along with the British government's policy of accommodating Muslim demands, it unintentionally created a situation where the Moplahs felt they could get away with anything. It let the violence get out of control. He even points to instances where British officials actually helped the Moplahs, giving them weapons and information in exchange for their support against Hindu landlords who were seen as getting in the way of British control. Deepak's work sheds light on the tough choices British administrators faced, caught between their ambitions for the empire and their responsibility to protect everyone they ruled, no matter their religion. He argues that the British, motivated by a mix of pragmatism and a misguided belief in divide and rule, ultimately failed to protect the Hindu community from the horrors of the Moplah riots. The way the British handled, or rather didn't handle, the Moplah riots, it really damaged the relationship between Hindus and the British. It reinforced the idea that the British government was willing to sacrifice Hindu interests to keep Muslims happy, which just made the communal divide even worse and increased the distrust of colonial rule. Deepak's book shows us that even when faced with unspeakable horrors, political convenience often wins out over doing what's right. As news of the Moplah atrocities spread, it sparked outrage and fear among Hindus across India. That dream of Hindu-Muslim unity championed by Gandhi and others, it started to unravel. And in its place, you had this growing sense of disillusionment and distrust taking root. This disillusionment actually led to the emergence of the Hindu Mahasabha. This was a Hindu nationalist organization that advocated for Hindu interests and self-defense. Figures like Lala Lajpat Rai, who had been skeptical of the Khilafat movement all along, they became prominent voices within the Mahasabha. They argued that Hindus needed to organize and protect themselves against what they saw as growing Muslim aggression. And the rise of the Hindu Mahasabha, well, it was kind of an unintended consequence of the Khilafat movement in a way. By aligning with this pan-Islamic cause, the Congress had inadvertently contributed to the growth of Hindu nationalism. Deepak argues this is part of what fueled the rise of Hindu nationalist groups. They promised protection in a world that felt increasingly dangerous, and figures like Swami Shraddhananda, well, they gave voice to that Hindu anxiety. Deepak brings up Shraddhananda's writing. He was warning about the dangers of pan-Islamism and telling Hindus, wake up, see the threat. It's really interesting how Deepak connects this to the rise of groups like the Akhil Bharat Hindu Mahasabha. He says these groups weren't just lashing out at Muslims. It was more like a growing awareness of Hindu identity, a need to defend their culture and religion. And you have the Congress Party still clinging to those secular ideals. Deepak suggests that in their push for a united India, they kind of missed the boat. They didn't fully grasp the fears of some Hindus.
And that created this space for Hindu nationalist groups to step in. They understood those fears, they spoke to them.
It's also a powerful testament to the resilience of the Hindu community, which, despite enduring all those horrors, ultimately survived and rebuilt their lives. But the Moplah riots also had a profound impact on how Hindu nationalism developed in India. The brutality, the perceived apathy of Congress, Gandhi's initial reluctance to even acknowledge how bad it was, it fueled a sense of resentment and insecurity among Hindus. And this led to the Hindu Mahasabha becoming more powerful and influential. They advocated for Hindus to defend themselves and have a stronger Hindu identity. Figures like V.D. Savarkar and Dr. Keshav Baliram Hedgewar, who would go on to found the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS, they became prominent voices within the Mahasabha. Their argument was that Hindus needed to organize and protect themselves from what they saw as growing Muslim aggression. However, Deepak also points out the debates within the Hindu Mahasabha itself, especially about their relationship with the Congress and the larger fight for freedom. Some within the Mahasabha wanted to cooperate with the Congress, while others, like Savarkar, thought they should go their own way, focusing on making Hindus stronger and asserting their interests. These internal divisions showed just how complex the Hindu nationalist movement was, and how difficult it was to navigate the relationship between religious identity and national aspirations. So the Moplah riots, they weren't just a turning point for Hindu-Muslim relations. They were a turning point for how Hindus thought about politics. The violence unleashed by the Moplahs, it left a permanent mark on the Hindu psyche. It contributed to a growing sense of Hindu consciousness and a feeling that they needed to protect themselves. After the Moplah riots, there was a lot of soul-searching going on, especially for Gandhi. The violence really shook him. He was struggling with the fact that his vision for Hindu-Muslim unity had failed. The Congress, they were at a crossroads too, torn between sticking to nonviolence and the growing pressure to be more assertive in their fight for independence. The Hindu Mahasabha, though, they actually felt stronger after what happened in 1921. Their calls for Hindus to unite and rely on themselves only got louder. Figures like Savarkar and Moon Jae, they argued that Hindus couldn't depend on the Congress or Gandhi to protect them anymore. They started pushing for a more, militant approach, you could say. They emphasized physical fitness, martial training, and rejecting what they saw as the Congress's pacifism and appeasement policies. And it's important to remember why the Hindu Mahasabha gained support. It was a direct reaction to the threat that Hindu society felt. The Moplah riots, they shattered that idea of peaceful coexistence. Many Hindus truly believed their survival was at stake. So the Mahasabha's message of strength and unity for Hindus, it resonated with a lot of people, especially those who had seen the horrors of 1921 firsthand. This growing divide between Hindus and Muslims, it really messed with Gandhi's plans for civil disobedience. That mass support he had imagined, Hindus and Muslims united in their march towards freedom, it wasn't realistic anymore. The communal divide was too wide, the wounds from 1921 still too raw. When Gandhi tried to launch civil disobedience in 1922, it didn't work. The Chauri Chaura incident, where Congress supporters turned violent, it made him doubt if the masses could actually stick to nonviolence. He realized that India wasn't ready for the kind of mass movement he had in mind. The British government saw this division in the nationalist movement and decided to, play it smart. They reached out to more moderate leaders like Annie Besant and Surendranath Banerjee, offered them some concessions, hoping to isolate Gandhi and the more radical parts of the Congress. And you know what? It worked. The Congress split further. The moderates took the British offer, while Gandhi and his followers remained committed to confrontation. This weakened the nationalist movement and delayed progress towards independence. Deepak argues that what happened between 1921 and 1924 was a turning point for India's journey towards its own constitution. The dream of a united India, a dream shared by many at the start of the 20th century, it was fading. What took its place was this hardening of religious identities, a widening gap between communities. It's like the seeds of partition were sown during this time, eventually leading to that bitter fruit in 1947. Deepak's book really makes you think about this crucial period in Indian history. He doesn't shy away from difficult truths or try to oversimplify things. He challenges us to confront the complexities of the past and to understand how good intentions can sometimes lead to terrible outcomes. It's a reminder that history is never just black and white. It's full of different perspectives, difficult choices made under pressure, and unforeseen consequences. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder, could partition have been avoided? Or was it always going to happen because of the historical forces at play? Deepak doesn't give us a clear answer. But he gives us the context, the insights we need to wrestle with this tough question, a question that still matters today. Maybe by understanding the mistakes of the past, we can work towards a future where those tragedies don't happen again. That's what's so powerful about history. It makes us think, it makes us learn, and it gives us hope for a better tomorrow. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Sai Deepak's book. It's been a journey through a complex and crucial period in India's history. If you're fascinated by this period of Indian history, I'd say definitely check out Sai Deepak's book. It's a deep dive worth taking.